Well, good morning. Welcome. I hope everyone had a fantastic evening last night. You had the chance to get out a little bit. I know we are really excited to have the conference here. Um, the resort has been amazing hosts, and we are just ecstatic and so appreciative of the facility and all the activities there is to do here. Um, and we're grateful you guys have come to join us for this conference here at Bryce Canyon. Just real quickly this morning, we have a couple announcements before we get into the welcome. We do want to thank our sponsors. Um, they are here shown on the slide. They're in the program. If you have the opportunity over at Ruby's Inn, we do have the sponsors are over there at the tables. You have the opportunity to sit down and visit with them, get a better understanding what it is that they do. But without our sponsors, we would not be able to hold events like this as well as our other events throughout the year. So if we can get a big round of applause for our sponsors and show appreciation. We also, a lot of work did go into this conference, as you can imagine, and as you will see throughout the day, and as you experienced yesterday. And so if we can get a big round of applause for our conference planning committee. If you're here, please stand up as we show our appreciation. I saw some half stands, but if you see these individuals, please be sure to thank them. And we are looking forward to our fall conference in Davis County next year. So if you're interested in serving on that committee, let us know. Huge thank you to Nicole. Without Nicole, without Nikki, see, I don't even have to ask for the applause. It just happens. We are so grateful for Nikki and all the work that she puts into these events. So thank you, Nikki. The APA Utah Board. We went through a reorganization process, new bylaws last year, and we have a new board. We're about 4 months in. Things are going fantastic. I am so excited. I feel so honored to serve alongside these individuals. They truly are an inspiration, and I am so excited about the direction the organization is going under their leadership. And so we can get a big round of applause for the APA Utah board. As part of the reorganization, we are working on, we have a lot of open volunteer positions to help backfill in the organization with our restructuring. And so if you're interested in serving with APA Utah in some capacity, in volunteering in some capacity, we do have plenty of opportunities, so feel free to scan the QR code. We also are working on engagement groups, and we have 4 engagement groups that meet at least quarterly, focusing on our volunteers, our volunteer planners, the planning commission members, transportation roundtable, the early career planners, and beyond city limits. So these are the engagement groups that they have all of them have already met, but it's an opportunity to sit down and visit with planners that are dealing with similar issues or seeing similar things as you may be seeing. So we encourage you to sign up for those groups. And there are QR codes around to sign up for those codes as well as on the website, the APA Utah website. We do have the opportunity for student poster projects. So we have some here in this room in the Ebenezer. I encourage you to take a look at the projects. The students will be presenting them. They are standing and explaining what it is that they are, what they've been working on. And these are students from Utah State University. And then later this month, on the 22nd, we have the opportunity for a networking social and student poster showcase at the University of Utah to first, similar to review and take a look and have the students explain the projects that they've been working on with their posters. So we encourage you to attend those events. We do have a RSVP available for the University of Utah events if you're interested in going. Along with our reorganization, we do have elections every year now for the board. And this year, in 2026, the positions that will be up for election as president and vice president, as well as one of the board member seats. And so if you are interested in serving on the APA Utah board, the QR code will take you to the bylaws, so you can take a look at the bylaws and the handbook, so you can take a look at the responsibilities, and then keep your eyes out for an email when the nomination site will open, which is later this week, next week, April 10th, for those positions to open. All right, there's a map in the program. Hopefully, you've figured things out if you've been here. If you were here yesterday, if today this is your first morning, we are number 2 on the map. The Best Western is to the north that way, and that is where the Cottonwood and Ponderosa rooms are. Those sessions there, and then number 1 is across the light, across Main Street. And that is where the Red Canyon room is, where we do have snacks set up as well as our sponsors. And then the sessions are over there as well on the 2nd floor above the Red Canyon room. All right, with that, I'm going to get into my welcome. So the Districts Conference, the theme is resilient by design. And I honestly can't think of a more timely or appropriate theme for the work that we're doing in the environment, in the landscape that we're doing the work in currently. So today I just want to spend a few minutes talking about what resiliency really means, and not just in the planning concept, but as a way of thinking about our communities, our institutions, and this moment we are all living through. So we are living and working in a time of extraordinary change, whether it's technological, whether it's institutional, politically. We are seeing amazing change at rapid speed. As planners, we are being asked to respond to pressures coming from every direction: housing affordability, transportation demands, infrastructure needs, environmental hazards, demographic shifts, political polarization, and economic uncertainty. And increasingly, it can feel like we are planning in a world where the ground keeps moving beneath our feet. That feeling, that sense that things are unstable, that systems are under stress, that institutions are being tested, it's not just local, it's not just national, this is global. It's a global feeling, and it's deeply personal for many people. They are feeling this strain. And that's part of the reason why this theme matters so much at this time. Because resilience is not just about what happens after disruption. As you all know, it is about how we prepare before it. So recently, for those of you that know, I've spent a lot of time commuting, and I was listening to a podcast with Jon Stewart and Heather Cox Richardson. And the conversation, it wasn't directly about planning, but honestly, it could have been. At its core, it was about this feeling that many people have right now, that the world feels unstable, unpredictable, and maybe even fragile. Their discussion focused on a simple but yet very powerful idea. Instability does not mean collapse. It means we are in a moment where institutions matter, civic actions matter, and quite honestly, design matters. Richardson's point was that history is full of moments where people felt like everything was coming apart. Yet, the most important response in those moments was to not panic. It was whether people had built systems, communities, and institutions capable of adapting. That is planning work. That is exactly what all of you are doing. When communities are under pressure, people need People do not need less planning. They need better planning. They need systems that can absorb stress without failing. They need institutions that still function when conditions become difficult. They need leaders who can think beyond the immediate crisis. And they need places designed with enough flexibility, redundancy, and foresight to adapt when the unexpected happens. That is what resiliency looks like in practice. Not perfection, not rigidity, not pretending we can predict every storm, but building communities that can bend without breaking. And in this, it brings me to a memory from my childhood, and I shared this in the program as well. So I grew up in Michigan, and my family has a cabin. They still have a cabin in northern Michigan on a lake. And on that property, there was this huge willow tree. Honestly, it wasn't the tallest tree on the property. It definitely was not the strongest looking tree on the property. Its branches hung low, sometimes brushing the ground, made it difficult to mow around. Its trunk bent and twisted in ways that made it look almost fragile. But that tree was one of the most memorable places for me as a kid. There was so much entertainment and enjoyment to be had. Climbing it, swinging from it, sitting beneath it during the long summer afternoons. But what was most fascinating, what I honestly probably enjoyed the most about that tree, was watching it in the storms. And those of you who are from the Midwest, you know that there are good size storms that come through. And we were on the lake, and there were tornadoes that I remember as a kid hitting the lake. And so we got a lot of wind, lightning, rain in these storms. And how that tree, it bent, it swayed, and how it moved in the storm. But it always remained standing. So there's an allegory of the willow and the oak. Some of you may remember, if you were at our conference last spring, I talked about an oak tree. And now I'm talking about a willow tree and putting them side by side. So that oak tree, if you recall, it tried to resist growing when a rifle was hung from its branch, and it ended up growing strong, but it had this huge bend in it. And that's the nature of an oak tree, is it tries to resist. It tries to show its strength through resistance. So when major storms hit, that's what the oak tree does. Just with its strength alone, it stands firm, rigid, and unyielding. And under enough pressure, that rigidity becomes its weakness. Because eventually, if it can't flex, it will break. The willow, on the other hand, survives differently. Not because it's weak, and not because it avoids the storm, because it's designed to adapt. Its flexibility allows it to absorb force rather than shatter under it. And in many ways, that is what this conference theme is asking us to think about. Are we designing communities like oaks or like willows? So, as planners, we often talk about resilience in technical terms, and those terms matter. But stripped down to its essentials, resilient by design means intentionally building systems that can continue to function when conditions change. It means building in adaptability so communities can respond to new realities, redundancy so one failure doesn't collapse the whole system, strength so infrastructure and institutions can withstand stress, interconnection so systems support one another, and preparedness so we are not always reacting after the fact. This is a fundamentally planning-centered way of thinking, because planning at its best is the discipline of preparing communities for the future we cannot fully predict. For planners, resiliency is not just a buzzword. It's a design framework and a governance framework. It asks us to think beyond single projects and individual approvals. It asks us to think in systems. Transportation is connected to housing. Housing is connected to jobs. Jobs are connected to water, energy, and land use. And land use is connected to public health, environmental quality, and social cohesion. When one system weakness weakens, the impact ripples across all the others. Resilience requires us to design for those relationships, not just for isolated outcomes. And importantly, resilience also depends on trust. Trust in institutions, trust in process, trust in local capacity, and trust that communities can solve hard problems together. That may be one of the most, if not the most, important challenge of our time. One of the most important ideas in resiliency work is this. The goal is not simply to bounce back. I had a conversation with my 6-year-old daughter, Charlie, actually about this conference and what I was talking about. And I was talking about this concept of bouncing. And she was like, oh, well, like a rabbit. I think because we just had Easter, rabbits were on our mind. And I said, yeah, exactly, like a rabbit. And we talked about how it's important to not bounce back, but to bounce forward. And she was like, yeah, because if a rabbit just bounced up and down, it wouldn't get anywhere. It wouldn't be able to eat. It has to bounce forward. And I was just amazed at what a simple concept my 6-year-old daughter was able to grasp, and the importance of that concept in the work that we do. That it is not simply just bouncing back to where we were, but it is about bouncing forward to reach those goals and accomplish those things that we have set out to do. So we all know that disruption happens. Flood, fire, droughts, housing crisis, infrastructure failures, economic downturn, or institutional breakdowns. So we don't just try to restore what was. We ask, what did this disruption reveal? Where were we vulnerable? And what was already not working? And how do we rebuild in ways that make us stronger, more equitable, and better prepared next time? And that is when resilience becomes transformational. It's not just defensive, but it is generative. So across Utah, we're already seeing what resiliency by design looks like in practice. We've seen communities preparing for drought with long-term water uncertainty. We see wildfire planning, emergency preparedness, and hazard mitigation. We see it in transportation systems trying to adapt to rapid growth. We see it in communities grappling with housing affordability and land patterns that must evolve. We see it in downtowns and local economies trying to remain viable as conditions change. And we see it in local governments doing difficult, often underappreciated, definitely underappreciated work to keep communities functioning amid competing demands and limited resources. This is not abstract. This is the daily work of planning in Utah. And the people doing that work are in this room. But resiliency is not just about physical infrastructure. It's not just codes, maps, plans, and policies. It's also human. It is very human. It lives in the creativity of staff and practitioners, the willingness of communities to collaborate, the courage of decision makers to think long term, and the persistence required to keep building trust in difficult environments. One of the strongest messages from that podcast with Jon Stewart and Heather Cox Richardson in their conversation was that people often mistake instability for inevitability. But the future is not fixed. What happens next depends in part on whether we continue to do the work of building capable institutions and healthy communities. Planners, are part of that work. Not all of it, but an essential part of that work. It is also why this conference matters. A conference like this is not just a professional event. It is part of how we build resilience in the profession itself. Because resiliency depends on shared knowledge. It depends on relationships. It depends on learning what is working elsewhere and what is not working, and how we can improve in our own practice. Every conversation you have, every session you attend, every challenge you wrestle with, and every connection you make is part of strengthening the planning profession here in Utah. And in that turn, strengthens the communities we serve. So, as we begin this conference, I want to leave you with a challenge. As you move through these sessions, ask yourself, where are our communities too rigid? Where are our systems too brittle? Where are we relying on short-term fixes instead of long-term design? And where do we have opportunities to build in greater flexibility, equity, and resilience? If the storms are inevitable, and they are, then our responsibility is not simply to hope they pass. It is to design communities that can meet those storms, communities that can adapt, that can endure, communities that can recover, and communities that can emerge stronger. So I keep coming back to that willow tree. It survived not because it was the hardest thing in the landscape, but because it was rooted, it was flexible, it was built to move with the forces around it. That is a powerful model for planning, and I believe it to be a powerful model of this profession. I hope this conference inspires each of us to think about how we can design our plans, our policies, our communities with that same spirit, so that when the inevitable storm comes, our communities will not simply endure them, they will be stronger because of them. Thank you for the work you do every day to shape resilient communities across Utah. And welcome to the 2026 ABA Utah Spring Conference. But yeah, please, announcements. Would you like to make it? All right. Marlon?
Hello, everyone. How's it going? Great. So, Jason gave us all a challenge, and I would like to give you all another challenge today. If you didn't know, Bryce Canyon was featured on an episode of Sasquatch. And we have put out little Sasquatches for a scavenger hunt. In the back table where you all checked in, we have these little clue cards, and that will lead you on a scavenger hunt to find all the Sasquatches. The person who gets through the whole challenge of I don't know how many clues wins a $100 gift card. There's 5 clues. Yes, and you have to keep all your cards. They are in the back. And so when the first card is, well, we can all get up, we can all stretch, we can all get ready for it. We have one more opening session after that. You can begin the race. I am going to read out the first clue. And you can also pick up your clue cards in the back if you forget. Our first clue is that the emberback believes even forests need good flow. Where people gather, directions must go. Find the place where maps lead the way and planners begin their day. At that spot, you will find your second clue. Yeah, the first clue's a given. Oh, we did. Where?
Never.
Oh, is that true?
The first plea is back.
I was unprepared for this.
It,
You read to right? Yeah. Okay. We're good. Yeah.
who wants back there?
Yes, you can grab your not back there. What?
No. We wouldn't. All of the clues are not together in the same room.
Yeah. Yeah. Disregard this whole conversation. But yes, you should just record the clue. Yes. So you can pick up your Clue 1 cards in the back. These are a freebie. And then you will find Clue 2 where planners begin their day and maps lead the way. All right.
Scavenger hunts are difficult, apparently, for a group of individuals, especially planners, to put together. So we hope you guys have as much joy in reading the clues and finding the next clue as we had in trying to figure out what it meant and how it works. Yeah. If you guys didn't hear, Nikki made it clear APA Utah did not make these clues. This was done by our graphic designer, who's a sponsor and also helped with the programs. So don't blame us if it's difficult to follow, because as you can see, we had a difficult time following. All right. With that, we are going to move into our keynote for this morning. We are privileged to hear from Ryan Handy. And her work has included development, permitting, workshop facilitation, and running technical assistance programs to help communities plan the effects of changing climate. Her expertise supports the Headwaters Economic Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program, which has helped more than 80 communities across the country increase their wildfire resilience. With a master's degree in urban and regional planning, as well as being AICP certified, Ryan has a particular interest in watershed level solutions to problems such as post-fire flooding. What I find really intriguing and I'm excited about is her experience of more than a decade as a journalist, working for newspapers in Texas and Colorado, and drawing on her master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. So the effects of climate change on the American West has been a passion and common thread through Ryan's life and her professional career. And we are excited for her presentation this morning. So with that, let's welcome Ryan up.
Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Ryan Handy from Headwaters Economics. I come to you from Helena, Montana. Yesterday, I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to also be learning from everyone in Utah. I have been watching some of the work that you all have been doing with wildland urban interface codes and post-fire flooding from afar, and I'm looking forward to learning more about both those things at this conference. So today, I think what I have to talk about is really going to complement our introduction, thinking about adaptation. And I am essentially going to talk about wildfire risk in Utah, not just what kinds of fires have happened, but what those events reveal about how risk is created, how it spreads, and what we can actually do differently going forward. And one of the things I'll be focusing on is how massive disasters have influenced how we build, where we build, and our land use policies throughout American history. And this presentation in particular focuses on communities and homes because that's where the losses concentrate, and that's also where decisions matter most. So, to get rolling here. So if you can please indulge me to start, I want you to imagine this scene. It's a quaint, quiet community that, while beautiful and rich in scenic and natural amenities, is both unprepared and unmitigated against natural hazards. A disaster strikes in the afternoon, right during peak traffic hours, and in its wake, more than 130 people are dead, hundreds more have been injured, and thousands remain homeless and evacuated from their homes. Infrastructure, buildings, critical assets within miles have been destroyed or compromised. Sorry, I'm trying to scroll here. And the costs for response, recovery, and rebuilding are into the billions. I know this sounds really familiar to a lot of us, from, Hawaii to New Orleans. This could be any of those communities. And I know, speaking to all of you, that this resonates with some of your experience as planners on a smaller scale. I didn't clarify what kind of disaster this is. And while many of you understandably assume I'm talking about a wildfire, I am indeed talking about an earthquake disaster. In fact, it was the Great Alaska Earthquake of 1964. It affected the city of Anchorage, and the earthquake occurred in the evening of March 27th. It reached a magnitude of 9.2, and this earthquake remains the most powerful seismic event in North American history. And while its impact came at great cost to the people and communities of Anchorage, it was due to this singular pivotal event that we, as a society, started to think fundamentally differently about living with earthquakes as a seismic hazard. And it was this incident that, in many ways, inspired the use of seismic measures and predictions, as well as building codes that would prevent an event like this from happening again. So what is my point here? I thought we were here to talk about wildfire, not earthquakes. So my point is that when it comes to risk reduction to wildfires, or really any disaster that we face, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Important lessons can be learned from other hazard mitigation efforts because the basic formula for resiliency remains the same. In order to survive, sustain, and thrive in a rapidly changing world, we must adapt. And I know Jason just gave a great introduction about adaptation, and I don't know that I could do better than that. But what do I mean by adapt? And in the most literal sense of the word, adaptation is defined by the ability of a system to make adjustments in order to moderate or avoid harm. So to do so effectively, I would argue that adaptation is intrinsically proactive. It's deliberate and the strategic anticipation of potential outcomes. So adaptation requires, as we just heard, long-term sustainable solutions in contrast to short-term coping mechanisms. And if done correctly, adaptation applies a full systems approach across all sectors and scales to lead to true transformational change. Now, the thing that I find interesting here is that we have a long history of doing this around the world, but I'm going to talk specifically about the United States and planning as a profession. Disasters have had a long history of influencing how and where we build. And modern building codes, and some would say to some extent land use planning efforts, can trace their origins in the United States to 19th century urban conflagrations in major American cities, from New York to Chicago to San Francisco. And for instance, when we think about the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, it triggered a push for fire-resistant construction after a major inferno that lasted for days, killed 300 people, left 100,000 homeless, and erased more than 2,000 acres of the city. Something I thought was interesting about this fire is at the time, Chicago had 500 miles of wooden sidewalks, and it also had predominantly wood architecture. So following the Great Chicago Fire, the city was essentially wiped clean, and it gave people a chance to rethink how they built. And they built the fire-resistant materials, which is simply brick, stone, not wood. This fire, along with many other fires in the 19th century, also helped inspire paid fire departments. For most of the 19th century, fire departments were volunteer-based. They may not have existed. They often were not paid. So it is this series of urban conflagrations that inspired rethinking how we build. And this has continued throughout our history in the United States with other types of disasters. Now I want to talk about Hurricane Betsy, a hurricane that struck Louisiana in 1965. At the time, it was one of the most deadly, costly storms ever to make landfall in the United States. It killed 76 people in Louisiana and caused about, at the time, 1.5 billion in damages, which is equal to roughly 15 billion in today's dollars. So, of course, in 1965, there was no flood insurance available. To Americans, the private market had stopped insuring a lot of properties with flood risk at this time. So after this catastrophe, the federal government decided to establish a new program. And in 1968, they founded the National Flood Insurance Program to make flood insurance widely available, also to map flooding and to attach building regulations and measures to properties that were built in floodplains, and also to prohibit the development of buildings in certain areas of flood risk. Now, there are, as we all know, some concerns and issues with the solvency of the National Flood Insurance Program, but setting that aside, it has been in operation for nearly 50 years and is today one of the longest standing government-run disaster insurance programs in the world. Yet another phenomenal example of how we, as institutions and society, have adapted in the wake of a catastrophic disaster to rethink how and where we build. So many of us now think of wildfires as sort of course, we know here in the West, they've been part of our lives for a long time. But as they enter into urban areas, they are taking on a new feel. Urban conflagrations is this new kind of catchword. We hear a buzzword about major fires in Hawaii, California, Colorado, and they seem pretty new and horrifying. And the unfortunate fact is they have precedence as well. So I'm going to talk now about a fire that was more than 60 years ago in Los Angeles. And I want you to think about the fires that we had in LA in January 2025 and notice the parallels here. So this fire ignited in the Bel Air Brentwood area around in late November in 1961. And at the time, it was the most disastrous brush fire in the history of Southern California. It burned down the slope of the Santa Monica Mountains, and it raced through super dry vegetation, jumped Mulholland Drive, and went into really dense urban neighborhoods. It was driven by hurricane force winds, 15-mile-per-hour winds, really arid conditions, and continuous fuel continuity, which means there's a lot of vegetation and a lot of homes. The fire had a lot to eat, effectively. So this conflagration generated its own weather. It had thermal air currents created by intense heat of burning homes, and coupled with the high velocity of the winds, it effectively created a fire tornado. Sounds uncomfortably similar to what we have witnessed across the United States recently. And yet, the question I have is, what have these modern wildfires changed? What will they change? What are we going to do differently because of these new wildfires that we're facing across the United States? How will we meet this moment as we did in Chicago, as we did in Louisiana more than a century and half a century ago? So to back up here, I, again, and Ryan Handy from Headwaters Economics. Headwaters is a Montana-based nonprofit. We do independent, nonpartisan research all over the United States. I also work all over the United States. We are an economics research shop on one end, but on the other, we run technical assistance programs to help reduce disaster risk, specifically flooding and wildfire. And I represent our wildfire branch. I am the program manager of our program, Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire, which is about a decade old now, and it is a free, I'll say that again, free technical assistance program primarily funded by the U.S. Forest Service that is intended to help communities reduce wildfire risks to the built environment. So I deal with land use codes. In our time working across the country, we have done work from Lahaina all the way to the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. And we have worked with now upwards of 100 local governments across the country. I work primarily with municipalities and counties, fire departments, and planners. As a fun side note, I'm currently working with 30 communities in Colorado to help them implement their state's new mandatory wildland urban interface code, which goes into effect this July. So as part of this work, we have a lot of firsthand experience working in really high-risk areas around the country and looking at how building codes can contribute to adaptation, resilience, and ultimately survivability. And what we've heard from community leaders and fire personnel is that they're really concerned about their ability to protect property and human lives in the face of increasing risks, and the fact that our traditionally built homes are highly flammable. So part of what I'm going to talk about today is that particular challenge. How do we assess the wildfire risk that you all are facing in Utah? How our homes play into this particular risk and add to it? What consequences this has for all of us, and what resilience will look like for you and frankly many others around the country. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about wildfire risk in Utah from a more macro level, and I'm really going to zoom out here and take us back again to some urban conflagrations that have occurred around the United States and what Utah has in common with those. So as with all hazards, wildfire risks are increasing at a scale and a pace that we frankly cannot keep up with. And as much as we consider wildfire disasters such as the Camp Fire in Paradise, California, the Marshall Fire in Colorado, the fires in Lahaina, and most recently the fires in LA, as much as we consider these exceptional and once-in-a-lifetime events, scientific evidence would suggest otherwise. Our research, which I'll explain more in a bit, has found that more than 1,000 communities across the United States face similar urban wildfire conditions that match the characteristics that we saw in LA last year. So what does that mean? That means these communities have dense development, strong winds, lots of ignition sources, limited evacuation capacity, exactly the conditions that we saw in LA. So what we did following the fires in LA last year is we wanted to basically identify the conditions that contributed to the Palisades and Eaton fires and see where they replicated across the country. We did sort of filter our data and only looked at communities that had a certain degree of density within a certain space. And so it got us these 1,000 communities. One thing that I think is really unique about this particular map is it highlights wildfire risk in places that we would normally not consider. So take a look at Iowa. Take a look at the Gulf Coast. If you zoom in on this map, you can find it on our website. Biloxi, Mississippi is on this map. A great deal of communities in Florida. Those of you who know the Southeast shouldn't be surprised by that. So it really challenges us to rethink wildfire risk is a hazard in many places where it's not something that we typically plan for. So what does this look like in Utah? Again, I know this is not a super zoomed in map, and it only really shows a dense cluster of communities near Salt Lake City. Again, this just reflects urban conflagration risk. If you look at the map on the left, the dark red shows the actual wildfire risk. Utah has some of the highest general wildfire risk in the country. It's in the top 90% of states that have the highest wildfire risk. But in particular, the cluster of communities around your most densely populated areas in the north are at high risk for urban conflagration. There's more than 40 of these communities. There's also a little patch of them that you can't see because of my slide down in the southwest corner as well. So the lesson here is simple but uncomfortable. If we treat these events as one-off tragedies, we guarantee repeat losses elsewhere. And this isn't about where fires burn, it's about what happens when they do. Risk to homes reflects exposure, it reflects construction, spacing, layout, planning. Those are all decisions that we in this room can control locally as county officials, community leaders, planners, even individual homeowners. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So to break down a little bit further, what are the elements of key that make Utah's risk so high? It'd be really similar across many communities in the Western United States in particular. There are a few converging factors. One is what I'm going to call topographic variability, which contributes to strong downslope wind patterns, which can fuel fires. So this basically means you have lots of hills and mountains and flat areas underneath, which means that winds can come racing down those mountains and push fires into communities. Utah also has a mix of what we call fuel types. There are lots of trees and shrubs and invasive grasses. And this means that there's sort of continuous and intense fuels that fire can eat and burn its way to communities. And then finally, a really important part, Utah is not unique here. There's a lot of development, a lot of growth, a lot of expansion, which means we have a lot of people, communities, infrastructure exposed to both flames and embers. So now I'm going to talk to you a bit about how homes themselves are part of this mix of fuel that feeds wildfires and makes them so much worse, makes them into urban conflagrations. So to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how fires burn homes down. Forgive me if you all know this really well, but it's always good to review this with everybody. So first, this research comes from our partners at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. The first way that fires burn homes down is through what we call direct flame contact. I actually think this is what most people think of when they think of a wildfire coming to their community. They think of a flame actually going right up to their house and burning it down. Another way that homes can burn down is from radiant heat. So, like when you're sitting too close to the campfire and your boot starts to melt. This is the amount of heat energy released by a burning object. And of course, the bigger the burning object, the more energy is being released. So homes close together can sort of ignite based on radiant heat. And the final way is what we call embers. And it's the lofting of these embers that can fly miles ahead of a wildfire. And if they land on any flammable surface, they can grow in size and intensity and become what we call a spot fire, leading to exposure to homes. And in fact, embers are the primary culprit of home loss during a wildfire, and they account for 90% of all of home loss during wildfires. So once one home starts to burn from ember ignition, radiant heat will then become the dominant threat. And you can get this, what we call home-to-home ignition spread, which is what we've seen in these conflagrations where homes are just burning like dominoes, knocking each other down. So we also have tested this in the laboratory setting. What you're looking at here is the IBHS test facility in North Carolina, where they have these huge ember generators and fans that blow nothing but embers at buildings they've constructed in this massive facility, so they can watch how these buildings burn and what parts of them are vulnerable. So now we're going to watch what this looks like in real time. So these images show two homes exposed to the same ember storm as we think of it. The difference in outcome isn't luck, it's design, it's building materials. Ignition resistant materials, enclosed eaves, fire mesh vents, and a non-combustible immediate zone around the home will dramatically change the home's survivability. So the home on the left is built with cedar siding. It has a wooden door, as single pane windows, open eaves and soffits and vents, which means its soffits at the top are relatively large. It has bark mulch vegetation, and it has some juniper plants that go right up against the home. The home on the right, or I guess, yeah, my right, is built with ignition resistant materials. So this includes fiber cement siding, a metal door. It has rock mulch, not bark mulch. It has closed eaves and soffits, double paned windows, and there's no plants within 5 feet of the home. So we're about 4 minutes into the demonstration already, and immediately you can see that the bark mulch surrounding the left side of the home has caught on fire. And that makes sense. It's a large surface area that's highly flammable. The flames start to grow quickly as they catch the junipers and other vegetation that are up against the home. And now the home is on fire. The fire is moving vertically up the side of the home, up the cedar boards, and into the open spaces of the roof, and likely into the attic vents. And it will quickly penetrate the home. Just think about, what do you have in your attic? You know, you might have blankets, Christmas decorations, old clothes, boxes, lots of flammable items up there. Notice nothing on the right side has ignited yet. So now the flames are also moving horizontally and have spread underneath the very small deck, which is also made of wood and is catching the deck on fire from underneath. This will quickly expose the wooden door to flames and then catch all of that on fire. All of the windows on this home are single paned, meaning you can't see it here, but they will eventually become so hot they will burst with intense heat, allowing embers and flames directly into the home, at which point this home will be considered a loss and not savable. So IBHS has repeated this experiment 3 times in a row over a number of years and a number of different times. And every time they had to completely rebuild the home on the left, but the home on the right survived with minimal smoke damage. So I mentioned the phrase earlier, ember storm, and this image reinforces what that looks like. And it also reinforces the scale of ember exposure. Embers, sometimes called firebrands, they behave like wind-driven ignition sources. They land on roofs, decks, gutters, across entire neighborhoods. They literally are like a rain of fire. It's sort of like when you're sitting by the campfire and it starts spitting up all of these like pieces of ash. That's what a wildfire does on a massive scale. And it can send these many, many, many miles in front of the front. So similar to what you saw in the video, there are thousands of these little balls of fire being hurled through the air ahead of a wildfire. It doesn't matter if you live next to a forest. It doesn't matter if you live in the wooey. If something's on fire, you're within miles of an ember storm. So the difficulty with these types of storms, with these intense winds that drive them, with all of the ignition points, is that we are finding they are essentially impossible to stop once they start. Even the most sophisticated firefighting technology and equipment, like they have in Los Angeles, cannot get in and save homes because it is too dangerous for firefighters. So when you mix severe wildfire potential with strong winds, fire spread happens so quickly, suppression is quickly overwhelmed. So this is how community scale loss begins. One structure ignites, and it then spreads to others through embers and radiant heat. And once multiple buildings are burning, suppression, as I said, is impossible. And the wildfire will begin to exploit all the weak points in this system. So missing just one control point, spacing, materials, fire access, water availability, property maintenance, all of these are weak points that allow wildfires to spread. And risk will accumulate over time through many of these small decisions, not just one big failure. So then our goal, and what I want to talk about today, is how we change this narrative, how we stop this from happening, what role we all can play as planners and community developers. And that is to build ignition-resistant structures. This means homes like the one in the video that can survive multiple ignitions, gale force winds, extreme heat, and where there cannot be a firefighter there to put a flame out, the home can survive on its own. This is not a new concept. It's one that those of you who live in a wildland-urban interface or in a rural area may be really familiar with, but it's somewhat new in the context of dense urban areas. So I want to talk a little bit more about why homes are the true fuel that is feeding these disastrous conflagrations that we're seeing. I'm going to show a couple of images of post-fire disasters that really illustrate this really well. So this image challenges a common assumption, which is that if you have green vegetation, you have low risk, or that your risk is the vegetation. Green vegetation does not mean low risk. In these ember storms, what we frequently see are communities burned to the ground while trees and landscaping have remained green. And what this means is the flammable objects here were the homes, not the vegetation. The homes lit each other on fire. And this is becoming an increasingly common post-fire landscape, because you will see, here's another example of a community completely leveled after a wildfire, and there's a row of unburned surviving vegetation in the middle. So in other words, embers landed on flammable structures and burned while the inflammable, potentially well-watered surfaces survived. So this particular photo from Washington, I think, is really interesting because it shows the distance that embers can travel ahead of a fire front. And this is why, here we have a neighborhood that burned down when the actual fire ignition was several miles away. And this is why defensible space, which is really just managing the vegetation around your home, alone is not enough. Ignition resistance must be built into the homes and the neighborhoods themselves. And I've heard this from people on the ground in Lahaina, in California, in Colorado. They have all watched as embers have burned their homes down while their landscaping remains untouched. So there are many consequences of this particular scenario. We're familiar with all of them, but I want to talk about a particularly thorny one and what implications it has for people's ability to buy homes, to live in communities, and also for your ability as a municipality or a county government to get the funding that you need to do your job. So let's talk about what might happen if change does not occur. So these conflagrations, these mass destruction of wildfires and of homes has led to a wildfire insurance crisis. I want to be really clear that insurance is a symptom, not a driver of this crisis. Insurance rates go up as more homes burn down. And the goal right here is really to keep homes from burning, which will help solve this particular crisis. So let's talk a bit more about what this crisis means. It is essentially the rapidly unfolding dichotomy between adequate insurance coverage and increasing wildfire risk. So wildfires are getting more expensive. They are the fastest growing hazard-related damage, with 9 out of the last 10 most costly wildfires have occurred in the past 10 years or so. So for many insurers, what this means is that providing coverage in high-risk locations is becoming cost prohibitive. So as a result, insurance becomes unaffordable, inaccessible. It stresses homeowners and the insurance industry as well. Insurers can't cover their losses, and homeowners either go without insurance, they become underinsured, or pay higher rates for coverage that eventually become prohibitive. And this all leads to an unstable insurance market, which has cascading implications for all of us in communities and public and private sector workers. It means, of course, the housing market becomes difficult. If you can't get insurance, you can't get a mortgage, you can't buy a home, your property values will be affected. This also, though, has impacts on municipal bond financing and the funding of community services and capital improvements. If large chunks of your community are uninsurable, it's going to be very difficult for you to get extra money that you need to fund the basic public things that you need to do in your work. So when a disaster does strike, those without insurance will, of course, struggle to rebuild, acquire housing, they will be displaced, dispersion will increase, but also local governments' budgets will become strained, and the federal government will be expected to come in and spend billions of dollars in relief and recovery efforts. There's, with these urban conflagrations that are destroying thousands of properties at a time, there is some evidence to suggest that it's really impacting local property tax revenue. If you come from a state like mine, Montana, where there is no sales tax, you really rely on property taxes to fund a lot of your public stuff. So this is a scenario that plays out time and time again in recent catastrophic wildfires. And as much as we know how homes burn down, so too do we know what happens when the smoke clears after a fire. The impacts on insurance and the ability of a community to rebound are really significant. So how do we bring stability and course correction to this trajectory? Somebody skipped through. Okay. So basically, we have to think about, what homeowners want and what insurance companies are going to need. Homeowners need reliable, affordable, available insurance. And insurers need risk reduction to homes and neighborhoods. They need to see that our homes aren't as burnable as they were. So how do we achieve this? This slide shows a bunch of different risk reduction measures. I'm going to dive into some that are very planner specific here in a minute. But as you see, there are lots of different ways that we attack this wildfire problem. One, our response and suppression. Two, wildland fuels reduction. And then the remaining four are things that we all have control of. Policies for new construction, resources for retrofits, strategic public investment, infrastructure improvements. The thing I really want to highlight here is a lot of communities just rely on response and suppression and wildland fuels reduction and think they're covered. They think if we just cut down enough vegetation and fight fire in the hills or the mountains surrounding our community, we're fine. And I hope what I have shown you with Embercast and Ember Travel, you've come to realize that that is not enough. So now let's really get into what we all can do differently to make sure that our homes, but more importantly, our communities are more resilient in the face of these catastrophes. So this is the central question that I want you to think about for your communities. Do we want our communities to act as ignition points or as interruption points that stop fire spread? And the choice here is really shaped by policy, design, and maintenance. So remember that during urban wildfires, the key difference is that the homes themselves become sources of fuel, and they are what propagates the fire spread across neighborhoods, not the vegetation. So the ultimate goal of building and retrofitting our communities is to break this cycle. We have to transform our homes, our buildings, our communities into fire stops instead of fuel loads. So what does this look like on an individual homeowner level? When a home is effectively hardened and surrounded by proper defensible space, it can accomplish a number of critical things. These include becoming a fire break, at the structure level. A home that doesn't ignite or spread fire acts as a mini fire break within the community. If an ember lands on a Class A roof or a Trex deck or on fire-resistant siding, the home won't ignite and it will stop the fire's progression. Another thing it will do is provide a safer zone for firefighters. This is often, I find, not talked about enough. A hardened home with good defensible space offers firefighters a safer area to operate from, effectively a safety zone. They can focus their efforts on wildfire suppression rather than on individual structure protection. Basically, that means they can focus on putting the fire out and stopping it, and instead of having to run around and save homes. So this also has broad benefits for communities. Of course, when a significant percentage of homes in a community are hardened, that means the entire community becomes more resistant to wildfire. I also have to note that insurers know this. They know that one home being hardened isn't good enough, which is why a lot of people who do home hardening on the individual scale still have their insurance policies non-renewed or have their rates raised. Insurers know this only works if we all do it. So now I want to talk about the very specific things that homeowners can do. And these are also things that can be passed into code. They can be introduced into zoning, into building codes, and different measures. If you want to learn more about that particular aspect, I'll be giving a session on that after this later this morning. But many of the most foundational resistant materials, or what I'm going to call good strategies, are directed at minimizing embers and their exposure to homes. So these are really simple things like clearing your roof valleys and gutters from leaves, pine needles, burnable material, clearing your deck and underdeck area. I know a lot of us who have decks have a lot of vegetation growing underneath that should be cleared away. You should maintain your vegetation. Make sure that you don't have a bunch of dead plants around your home, things burning off the side. Another thing that's really useful is replacing the bottom 6 inches of your wall with metal flashing or wall intersections to make sure that embers can't creep up into your home. So many of these foundational mitigation measures can cost around $5,000 upwards to $10,000 depending on, site-specific conditions in your home property. So now I want to talk about the better alternative. Better mitigation measures build off of these foundational wildfire resistance strategies to address critical vulnerabilities where embers can penetrate into the interior of a home or where direct flame contact can ignite the siding of a structure. So these include non-combustible mulch and fence. This unfortunately means no bark mulch. It means fences made of fiber cement siding or metal fences. It also means replacing 6 to 12 inches of vertical siding at the bottom of your home with non-combustible material, and it means replacing your soffits and vents with this special mesh that will prevent embers from getting in. So these are pricier. They can cost around $15,000 to $20,000, again, depending on site conditions. So finally, I want to get to what I'm going to call the best wildfire resistance measures. These are the priciest, as you will see, but they also are the ones that you have the most control over and the ones that are frequently controlled by land use and building codes. They include Class A roofs, non-combustible gutter systems, so requiring metal gutters and downspouts, enclosed eaves with non-combustible soffits, and requiring dual-paned or tempered glass windows and doors. So some of these things are homeowner projects they can take on a weekend. Some of them are things that you can build into your codes and start requiring to ensure that people meet these resistant standards. So one thing I want to leave you with, I know I've talked about a lot of different ways to reduce risk, how high our risk is. At the end of the day, some of the most effective risk reduction strategies are the most affordable. They're the kind of things that can be spread really well through public education, through incentives, through landscaping codes. And they include things like addressing vulnerable intersections in flammable surface areas. So that means looking at where your deck meets your wall, looking at the surface areas that you have, like decks or your roof, and seeing how flammable they are. It also includes removing accumulated debris from the roof and valleys of your gutters. Costs no money, requires no special equipment or materials. You just have to remember to do it. Again, same with removing flammable debris from the top of and under deck area. Maintaining a non-combustible zone. This thing has become particularly important after some research that was done in California. A non-combustible zone is effectively a zone, a buffer of about 5 feet around a structure that has no burnable material. So you might have some pavers and some rock mulch, but you have no plants, you have no wood piles, no furniture, no nothing. And there's been a lot of evidence to suggest that this zone has meant the difference between burning homes down and surviving major fires. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I'm happy to discuss that with you. And then finally, thinking about breaking up what we think of as fuel continuity. One of the major ways that urban conflagrations has happened is when fires can just eat their way through from one end of your property to the other. In the Marshall Fire in Colorado, the fire primarily spread with wood fences that were attached to homes. The fire would burn down the fence, ignite the home would ignite the next fence, and that fence would burn right up to the next home. A fence will burn a juniper tree, and the juniper tree will light your home on fire. It's all connected. So what I want to leave you with here, and I hope my talk at the beginning and our discussion of our history really lay the groundwork for this, is that we do know how to respond to these disasters. We have done so for centuries, and it is our natural instinct to rethink how we build, where we build. We can do things better, smarter, and safer. And particularly this room, planners are sort of, to me, the unsung heroes of this particular response. You all have the know-how and the capacity to change how we build. And so I want you to think of everyone in this room as having everything that you need to tackle this issue. In some cases, it's just a question of political will. So thank you all so much for having me here. If you'd like to contact me and learn more about our research or our program, that's my email right here. That's also a newsletter that we send out on a regular basis with lots of information. And I'm once again honored to be here, and thanks so much for having me.
So we do have a few minutes. If you would like to ask Ryan some questions, we can have maybe 7 minutes of quick conversation if you have some questions. She is doing a session after as well, which you feel free to attend if you have want to learn more about this subject matter. So, but are there any questions we would like to have answered at this point? All right, go ahead.
So I'll be talking more about this in my next session. Part of the research we've done at Headwaters is price out how much it costs to build wildfire resistant construction. And the long story short is that there is very minimal difference between what we would call traditional construction and wildfire resistant construction. A lot of wildfire resistant construction is already being done, particularly in the case of affordable housing. So we're talking like Class A roof, fiber cement, siding. Also, it depends on your definition of affordable housing, but if we're talking about multifamily housing also has to apply to much higher fire code standards. So generally, it's safer. Has a lot of provisions in place that a single family home would not. So I do not think of wildfire resistant construction as an obstacle to building affordable housing. Yes, go ahead.
as or he will see glory or church at stop body or
That's a really good question. So yeah. So what I can say is there is some evidence to suggest that there is more insurance retainment as a result of wildfire resistant construction. I typically make it a practice of not guaranteeing people that their premium will be lowered. I do think the insurance industry has been behind on this and they are rapidly catching up. And I sincerely hope there will be some changes in that field. There are also some new efforts from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety where there are certification programs. You can participate in them. You could build your home to their specifications and you get an insurance certificate that is intended to guarantee continued coverage, not necessarily affordable coverage. I will also say a caveat with those systems and those programs is the standards are extremely high and very expensive. And there are some measures there that the average person cannot afford. Yes, go ahead.
well,
Is there any recommendation as setbacks increase, there is a lower opportunity for hazard? Is there any kind of correlation to that? Or is like, what is your recommended setback between structures based on the fact that Amber's seems to start this?
Yeah, there are some wildfire experts who will tell you that like a 30-foot setback between homes is is a good idea. However, I recognize that's not possible in every community. And what I typically recommend is that if you can't have that kind of setback between homes, that then you mandate fire resistant construction on between, parts of the homes that are close together. So if you have two homes that say are like 10 feet apart, each of those walls should be fire resistant siding. There should be no vegetation in between them. So that is also an equally effective measure. Another thing you can do is sort of like a zero lot line situation where you have homes touching each other and then sort of like a townhome situation and have the side of the home that's not touching follow fire mitigation measures as well. Go ahead.
How fire resistant are materials for fencing and siding such as vinyl or asphalt shingles? Cheaper stuff, but where does it fit between wood and higher rate?
Asphalt shingles are Class A. They're fire resistant, non-combustible, which is good news. They're the best it can get. I think I heard you say vinyl. Vinyl fencing materials. There's a lot of debate about this. They melt. They spread fire. I do not consider them non-combustible or fire resistant. There are some communities that will still allow them. But California, for an example, has banned them after much evidence to show that vinyl melts. Similar concern with vinyl siding, combustible, it melts. Vinyl window frames will also melt and allow fire to get into a home. So I do not recommend vinyl.
Any other questions? Oh, we got one in the back.
Okay, thanks. We have a state law that governs design and materials here in Utah, and I'm just wondering, with the Brain Trust here, is any of the fire-resistant possible requirements in conflict with that? I'm hoping Jordan might answer, actually. Somebody else.
I can't speak to what is it common when it is existing state law. I will say that is very common, and often when you pass on your wildland urban interface code, you have to go back and edit existing codes. Some communities, for instance, will require the use of certain types of combustible siding. It's very common in historic districts, for instance. Communities will require that you use combustible siding or replace with like material like a cedar shake roof. Very problematic, really increases fire risk. I'd be curious to hear if that conflicts in Utah.
Yeah, I might be proved wrong on this, but I think that was actually one of the carve outs when that bill was passed for prohibiting, design standards and dictating what types of materials you can use as, fire safety was kind of accepted from that. And I think they even added something the next year after that bill was passed to specifically say, for like a almost like window standards, so something about being in a blast zone or something. So I know that's something that they've thought about. So I think we're in the clear on that, though.
All right. Can we give Ryan a round of applause?
Thank you all.